Now it's my pleasure to introduce Amber LeMay. For almost 20 years, the members of the House of LeMay have been a part of Vermont's LGBT community. This group of drag queens has raised tens of thousands of dollars, awareness, and lots of attention for many LGBT groups and organizations through their talents and stamina. Whether it's hosting a bingo or trivia night, producing the Winter is a Drag ball, appearing in television commercials, or just walking down Church Street, the House of LeMay has helped make Burlington and Vermont a special place for the LGBT community. Tonight, mother-founder of the House, Amber LeMay, will read a chronology of events on the historic night of June 27, 28, 1969, that came to be known as the Stonewall Uprising.
The Stonewall Inn is located in the heart of Lower Manhattan's West Village, near the Meatpacking District. In 1969, this blue-collar neighborhood was frequented by gays, lesbians, drag queens, hustlers, drug users, and dealers. Christopher Park, across the street from the Stonewall, was a cruising spot and home to many homeless, disenfranchised people. The Stonewall Inn was owned and operated by the organized crime syndicate, and it was run as cheaply as possible, using tubs of stagnant water behind the bar instead of sinks, stealing rather than purchasing liquor, and adding water to stretch the booze. One thing they did not skimp on, however, were the payoffs they gave to local police in order to minimize the raids and to receive advance notice of any raids that would occur. This protection was comforting to the Stonewall's patrons, who were constantly threatened by humiliating and potentially life-ruining police raids wherever they gathered. The NYPD Morals Division learned that gangsters had managed to blackmail high-profile gay men in order to defraud the government, and that transactions were being conducted at bars in New York City. The Stonewall Inn was identified as one of these bars. Acting on this tip, the NYPD planned a raid under the pretext that the bar was operating without a license and watering down its liquor. Since it was clear that local police were colluding with owners, the NYPD Morals Division did not inform the 6th Precinct of the raid until the last minute. Seymour Pine was tapped to lead the raid. Pine was a distinguished officer and military man who had authored the U.S. Army's hand-to-hand combat training manual. He had a reputation for being incorruptible and having great contempt for organized crime. His objective was to ensure that the Stonewall Inn would never reopen its doors. He would not only confiscate contraband and arrest the staff, but would totally destroy the bar. June 27th, 1969, was a hot Friday night. Turnout at the Stonewall was high. Some present that night recalled being emotional after the funeral of gay icon Judy Garland, held in New York earlier that day. They felt a sense of community in their collective mourning. Historians argue about the funeral's significance, but there's no doubt that some Stonewall patrons were emotionally raw even before the night began. Undercover officers entered the Stonewall in advance of the raid to ensure they could identify the employees. At 1:20 a.m., at the height of the evening, and without any tip-off to the owners, police approached the entrance and shouted, "Police, we're taking the place!" There was a moment of chaos, but many patrons knew the drill all too well. Employees gathered in a back room. Anyone to believe in a violation of state law mandating that people wear at least 3 articles of clothing confronting to their legal gender, mainly trans people, drag queens, and lesbians wearing so-called masculine clothing like pants, were taken to a corner to be questioned or physically inspected. All other patrons were herded into lines and ushered towards the entrance where officers would check IDs. Anyone found without ID would be corralled into an adjoining room and arrested. The atmosphere during the raid was uncharacteristically tense, according to both police and civilian accounts. Typically, raids on gay bars inspired fear. Most bar patrons would simply be checked for ID and tossed out into the street to walk home, alone and ashamed. But that night was different. Patrons did not stand quietly in line. Many rebuked the police, questioning and challenging them. When police handled them roughly, patrons pushed back. Furthermore, the drag queens, lesbians, and trans people refused to be examined. To move things along, Deputy Inspector Pine instructed his officers to arrest them all and gather them with the employees. He urged his officers to clear the bar quickly. Patrons with IDs were checked and ushered out of the Stonewall. But on this night, they did not head home in shame. They stood outside in the street. Some were waiting for their friends. Others were simply curious. Still more were angry, and their anger kept them defiantly planted where they were. In a short time, as the bar was cleared, a large crowd had formed. The commotion attracted the attention of customers in neighboring bars, passers-by, and especially the youth crowd across the street. Some ran to tell their friends, bringing more queer people to watch the action unfold. Where was Facebook and Twitter when they needed it? The crowd looked on as the police escorted the arrested customers and staff to a waiting paddy wagon and patrol car. The organized crime employees were brought out first. They were greeted with boos, hisses, and catcalls from the crowd. When the drag queens were brought out, they did campy routines and strutted and sashayed, and the crowd went wild. The atmosphere was still tense, but for the most part, the queer response remained peaceful. It wasn't until resistant customers were dragged to the paddy wagon that the crowd became hostile. Many reports indicate that one lesbian customer in particular fought the police with all her strength. She fought from the bar to the patrol car, forced them back to the bar and back again to the vehicle before she was finally physically lifted into it and restrained. Either she or another woman in the crowd shouted for someone to do something. The crowd roared their disapproval at the police, calling them names and demanding their rights. The shouts became increasingly hostile and aggressive. Then small projectiles, coins and batteries mostly, were thrown at the police. Tires on police vehicles were slashed. When Pine feared the crowd might tip the paddy wagon and cars over, he sent them back to the precinct headquarters to unload the prisoners and return immediately. The hostility ebbed for a brief moment after the vehicles departed, then quickly returned. Pine and the other police pushed back against the crowd, charging into them to scatter and scare them. When an officer was hit in the eye with a projectile, Pine grabbed the man he thought was the perpetrator and dragged him into the bar, handcuffing him to a radiator. Outnumbered and afraid of increasing violence, the police retreated into the Stonewall, closing and barricading the door. Outside, the crowd erupted in fury. The homeless youth from Christopher Park were particularly agitated and began throwing larger projectiles and burning debris. Others threw cobblestones. They stopped cars in the street and rocked them. Several drag queens tore a parking meter out of the ground, turned it into a battering ram, attempting to break down the barricaded door. Inside the Stonewall, police radios did not work, so Pine and his officers were unable to call for reinforcements. They began to panic. Pine, who had fought the Battle of the Bulge, was afraid for their lives. They used a fire extinguisher to put out the fires caused by burning debris. Officers snuck one of their small female colleagues out of a vent to run for help. Guns were held at the steady. Just when the crowd was about to burst through the door, 2 fire trucks arrived, followed shortly by police backup, including another paddy wagon. They parted the crowd. The officers inside the Stonewall escorted the remaining prisoners to the newly arrived vehicles. The prisoners fought, and the crowd continued to shout, fight, and throw things at the police. As the paddy wagon was almost loaded and ready to leave, the Tactical Patrol Force arrived. Known as the Riot Police, the TPF were equipped with helmets, massive shields, tear gas, and heavy clubs. The fire trucks turned their hoses on the crowd. Patrolmen, TPF agents, firefighters did their best to clear the streets. Despite the incredible show of force by the police, the queer community persisted. They fought the police. They mocked them with songs and kick lines.